that there is free speech, there is academic freedom, that views can be expressed without there being anything untoward beyond that. So that's my role. I am expecting a really good evening. It's a subject that personally interests me a lot, and I hope we'll all share in that. I'm going to hand over to Mehman from the Islamic Society, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings and peace to all. And thank you for joining us on our last day of our Islamic Awareness Week. Thank you all for coming down to the exhibition and coming to all the talks. And I really hope you enjoyed our last talk today. Inshallah, before Brother Hamza comes to talk, we're going to have a short recitation of the Quran from Brother Naik, inshallah. So I'll pass over to him.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وقضى ربك ألا تعبدوا إلا إياه وبالوالدين إحسانا إما يبلغن عندك الكبر أحدهما أو كلاهما فلا تقل لهما أف ولا تنهرهما وقل لهما قولا كريما واخفض لهما جناح الذل من الرحمة وقل رب ارحمهما كما ربياني صغيرا ربكم أعلم بما في نفوسكم إن تكونوا صالحين فإنه كان للأوابين غفورا وآت ذا القربى حقه والمسكين وابن السبيل ولا تبذر تبذيرا إن المبذرين كانوا إخوان الشياطين وكان الشيطان لربه كفورا وإما تعرضن عنهم ابتغاء رحمة من ربك ترجوها فقل لهم قولا ميسورا صدق الله العظيم.
And now we move on to the talk, inshallah. I prepared this whole introduction for Hamza, but he says he doesn't want an introduction, but unfortunately that's not how things work around here. So,
ooh, Mabel!
Right, so, so today we're proud to present a talk from a very famous speaker, Hamza Tzortzis. A bit of background on him. He's an international speaker on Islam, and he was actually born and raised here in England, but is of Greek descent. He's a revert to Islam, as a lot of people may not know, and he's about to, yeah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Brothers and sisters and friends and academics, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Which basically means may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Brothers and sisters and friends, before we formally start, I'd like to thank Harry and thank Professor Mark Spearing, who's your Provost and Vice Chancellor. I think it's an honor them being here today, and it's not many universities that would even facilitate such an event with the presence of the Vice Chancellor. So I do believe that what he's doing today is actually something very positive, and it's a good milestone for academia in Britain. So a round of applause for them being here for sure. And I have to admit that probably maybe one of the reasons that they are here as well is because of some of my overzealous statements I've made in the past. And that's why I do make it a duty that every time I do speak at any campus, and I've done this for the past 7 years, that, not that I necessarily apologize, but I say we are human and we err. And I think today is going to be something positive, that we can interact with each other in a very frank, positive way. Having liberty to express ourselves, but couched in human language, so we go forward progressively, we don't regress as a community. I think that's very important for everybody to understand. So everyone game? Good. Right, so today's topic is, does morality need God? I think, in my humble opinion, we can answer this question in maybe 5 to 7 minutes. And after that, I want to talk about something which we don't really talk about when we talk about these things, okay? Now, when it comes to morality, what do we mean by moral? Now, when I talk about morality, I talk about something that's binding. I talk about something that's objective. I talk about something that we have to do. We have this necessary ought within ourselves that's pressing down on our lives that makes us realize we ought to do something. We ought to behave in a particular way. Don't get me wrong, there are loads of grey areas. That's what in medical ethics, for example, we have ethical committees and sometimes they can't decide. So I do appreciate there is the grey. But generally speaking, as a human species, we do have certain aspects of our morality that is binding and objective. For example, if my 7-year-old son was here and, God forbid, someone came and slit his throat for no reason, we would all agree that is objectively, morally wrong. And what we mean by objective is not that because I have a negative feeling or that there is some form of consensus in this room. No, it's objective because we believe that these morals are outside of our limited intellectual perceptions and our limited emotional dispositions. That's what we mean by objective. That's what we mean by objective, because if we don't mean that, then there are big moral problems. That means if everybody comes together and agrees that it's okay to slit his throat, then by the very definition it would be okay because everyone agrees. If we became all emotionally and psychologically deranged that we thought it was a good thing and we felt nice about the fact that we could slit a 7-year-old's throat, then by that definition, then it would be an okay thing to do. But we distance ourselves from such narratives, from such ontology, from such basis of morality. This is why we believe there are some morals that are objective, regardless of what we all say, and regardless of what we feel personally, and regardless of what I think individually. So morals have to be objective. They have to, in essence, be outside of the individual mind and individual human psychological experience. If that's true, if that's what we mean by objective morals, then I have to just be honest with you guys. That can only be a reality if God exists. I'm sorry. Okay? If you don't like it, well then we'll have a good Q&A. But at the end of the day, I truly believe if this is what we mean by objective morals, then it necessitates God's existence. Now let me explain why. I'm going to start by saying why the alternatives can't explain the existence of objective morals. What is the first alternative? Biology. Evolution via natural selection. Now let's think about this. Can evolution be a grounding for these objective morals? No. Why do I say this? Because firstly, it doesn't give them any meaning. Because we are as a result of cold, material, biological processes. A lengthy biological process. And we are just a reaction, if you like, a product of that conditioning, that biological conditioning. This is why Charles Darwin, he actually made an interesting point. He gave us an extreme example of what it means if our morals were just as a result of biology. And he gave the example of the beehives. There are bees in the beehive. And he says if we were to be reared under precisely the same conditions as the hive bee, we would think that it's okay to kill our fertile daughters. Because we're just a reaction to that biological conditioning. If you extend that example and talk about the nurse shark, then maybe it's okay to rape our mates if we were reared just like the nurse shark. Because according to National Geographic, by the way, the nurse shark wrestles with its own mate. Obviously, we don't believe in such things, but if we believe that evolution is a premise, a foundation, an ontology, a source for our objective morals, then we have a problem. Because they lose their meaning. Because if we were to be reared under other conditions, then our morals would change. So it's not objective by definition because they are subject to those biological and evolutionary changes. And that's very interesting. It's no wonder the atheist philosopher of science, Professor Michael Rules from Guelph University, he says, you think when you say love thy neighbor as you love yourself, you think you're referring above and beyond yourself. But you know, in actual fact, it has no true meaning. Evolution is about survival, not being moral. It's about survival. And sometimes you have to be immoral to survive. So evolution or biology doesn't provide a basis. Now you may argue, okay, forget evolution, specifically natural selection. Specifically natural selection gives us a foundation for objective morals. No, I totally disagree. Just like the moral philosopher Philip Kitcher, what does he say? He basically says that all natural selection does is give us a capacity to formulate ethical rules. It doesn't give us a grounding, it gives us a capacity. So evolution biology is out the way. What's next? Maybe we follow the humanist tradition. The British Humanist Association says that our morals is based on the human consensus, human values coming together, understanding what's good and what's bad. Fair enough. Many of us human beings are decent people, thank God, right? But I don't think from a philosophical perspective, it gives us a basis, it gives us a foundation for objective morals. Why? Let me give you an example. Say in history, pick any calamity in history, whether it's the massacre in Rwanda, whether it's Nazi Germany, pick any massacre in history and you would see, Serbia, Bosnia for example, in the 90s, you would see there was a quasi-consensus of people coming together. Yes, they were manipulated and some used radio, television, some used the political authority, but the point is there was a quasi-consensus that actually it was okay to kill the Tutsis, it was okay to kill our Jewish brothers and sisters. Do you see the point here? Because if you now start to think that society or social consensus gives the basis for objective morals, then we have a lot of problems. Therefore, it's like a form of social relativism. Why do we agree? Do we disagree with some things and agree with some things? If our reference point is only that social consensus. And if you study social psychology, you see we're shifting all the time. You can see this from a crude perspective, even the way we think about love. Love, for example, 100 years ago, love was more of a behavior. Now it's more like an internal feeling. You know, how do you feel about her? You know, that's why we have some crazy men who beat their wives. They ask questions and they basically say, "But I love her, really." It just becomes an internal feeling, and that has been shaped as a result of ideology in certain societies. Whether we have individualism that's focused in a particular society, which is generally inherent in a neoliberal society, or if you have a more communitarian society, like maybe Southern America or other parts of the East, for example, they don't really have that kind of atomistic, individualistic outlook for man, for human beings, man and woman, right? So we have social changes based upon influential social structures. So if you think it's just human beings coming together to decide what's right and wrong, you have a problem, because who dictates that? And if you look at any part of history that had a social consensus, then philosophically you have to agree with it, even if it disagrees with your current moral view. And if social consensus is changing, then your morals can't be objective, because you're saying it's right in the 1990s, but it's wrong in 2020. Problem. Biology's out the window, social consensus is out the window. What's next? Or we have another theory called moral realism, which in a nutshell, and I know it's crude, but I give you the point, which is that moral realism is morals are objective because they're objective. I think that's a bit of a cop-out, really. And then you could claim anything. I could claim, Islam is true because it's just true. Or, I think I'm 7'5" because I'm 7'5", right? I think I'm adopted. I don't care what anyone says to me, right? Middle child syndrome. Yeah, that's the middle child, right? So the point is, you can make all claims about anything. Moral realism, I think, doesn't really make sense of not only objective morality, but that kind of objective sense of obligation. Because even if you believe something's objective, then what obligates you to be just and to be compassionate? Just because it is? No, you need some kind of command. It's like something we owe or something that we do as a result of maybe a relationship or maybe understanding the basis of those ethical values. Just to say it just is doesn't give us that moral driving force. So from that perspective, any alternative you give, you don't have a basis for objective morals. Because remember, if an objective moral is outside of our limited mind and limited human psychological disposition, then it requires a grounding. Where did it come from? What's its source? Biology fails, natural selection fails, moral realism fails, social consensus fails. So what's the alternative? I believe God. God is the only concept that transcends human subjectivity. As Professor Ian Markham, a theologian, he said God is external to the universe. He can make the universal moral claim. And God, by the very definition of God, of a deity, of the creator, is that he transcends human subjectivity. He is like this anchor point that transcends all of this difference. And therefore, what he commands is good. Now, there's a problem here, obviously. It's only one contention to this argument, and the contention is, hey, Plato's dilemma, Euthyphro's dilemma. Everyone heard of this before, Plato's dilemma? Basically, Plato's dilemma is this. Is it good because God commanded it, or is it good because the commands of God are good? So is it good because God commanded it, or is it good because his commands are good? Now, there seems to be a dilemma here, because if it's good because God commanded it, then morals become quite arbitrary. Maybe if God commanded that, you should kill all 55-year-olds and above, then it's a morally good thing to do because he just commanded it. It makes morals arbitrary, not connected to who God is, but just based on an arbitrary command. And that's problematic theologically, and it's problematic for us because we already recognize that there are objective morals. So, that can't make sense. What about the other part of the dilemma? Maybe, but God's commands are good. But there's a problem. That means good is external to God's commands. You already know what good is. And you're judging God's commands by your reference of what good is. So you don't need good anymore. So the whole argument fails. So is there a third alternative? Yes, I believe it's a false dilemma. Like Professor Shabir Akhtar, in his book, published by Routledge, it's called The Quran and the Secular Mind, the Philosophy of Islam, he says, hold on a second. He doesn't say that, I'm adding the spice, of course. As an academic, you wouldn't say that, would you? Well, it depends. He said, there is a third alternative, that a morally stable God would command good things because of who he is. Because he is good. He is holy, al-Qudus. He is al-Rahman, he is the merciful, he is al-Wudud, the loving. He is the perfect. So his commands are derivative of his own nature, his own will. Now, someone may argue, but wait a minute, if you're saying his nature is good, then you still need to know what good is. But we're talking about this from a definitive perspective. God is the definition of good. Now you may argue, why is good the definition of good? Because God, especially in the Islamic theological tradition, is the only deity worthy of worship, and the only deity worthy of worship is the morally perfect being. So he defines what good is. Not that we require good to define God, but rather he is the very definition. So therefore his commands are good because he is good in the definition of good because he deserves to be worshipped, and that breaks the moral dilemma. So there you go. Does morality need God? Yes. But you know what? Forget the philosophical intellectual gymnastics for one moment. I want to turn the tables for a bit. Okay? Let's get ready for this. I want to talk about love. I want to talk about love. Because when we think about morality, at the end of the day, brothers and sisters and friends, love is the highest moral virtue. This is my view. I was brought up in that tradition. My dad's like a secular humanist spiritualist. Yes? That's why I've been confused for many years. Moved away from religious Greek church tradition dogma, like Buddhism, Sikhism, bits of Christianity, bits of this, that, and the other. I was brought up in that environment. And my dad had an existential crisis for a few years. But you know what? He's one of the most loving men in the world. For example, recently, he texted me the following. Let me tell you what my dad texted me. Right? Mr. Tzortzis. That's what my dad texted me, yeah? Here you go. He said, do I love the people, God's creation? If I do, then I know I love my Creator, which is my source of love. That's my dad.
That's cute.
That is cute.
Yeah.
And he does look cute as well. Especially for his age. So, and I look nothing like my dad. It was an indirect compliment, yeah? So, love is very important because I think love is the highest moral virtue. And I'm going to talk to you about love today. Now, brothers and sisters and friends, love is powerful stuff. The famous poet Rumi, he said, when the pen attempts to write about love, it breaks in two. Isn't that true? Because sometimes we find it so hard to even express our love. Like, I have quite a few children, right? And when I speak, for example, to Zakaria or Safiya or Ilyas, I basically want to show that I love them, but sometimes, you know, my teeth, they feel all funny. Like my mouth like almost trembles that I can't express those words because the minute they come out in words, they lose meaning because words are vehicles to meaning, and I think I have to invent another language. And that's why, I'm Greek, by the way, looking thoroughly Pakistani, but I come from a Greek background. I come from a Greek background, right? And in the Greek culture, maybe not the modern culture, but traditional Greek culture, we're very almost peacefully aggressive with our love. Like my dad, when he sees Zakaria and his grandchildren, we'd be on the dinner table and he'd just look at them funnily and he'd go, I love you, man! You'd be like that. That's how we break plates at wedding, right? Now, you can't express that in terms, breaking plates. Like, oh, you know, I love you. It's that kind of emphatic, kind of unquestionably without a doubt. That's why in nursery schools in Greece, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you'd have like, even teachers would pick up a child and it's like, suck on their cheek, or, you know, it's like, but for us in the contemporary sense, that'd be like, hey, we're calling social services. And this is why even in Egypt, you still have schools that are expressively loving. And the American teachers go over there like, I feel so liberated. I don't have a lawsuit just because I want to hug a child, right? Don't get me wrong, obviously we have these practices to protect our children as well. I do appreciate it's not that crude. But, you know, where have we become as a society? But anyway, so love is very expressive, and sometimes you want to violently express it in a peaceful way. That's not oxymoron, but you get the point. Now, and there are different types of love. One type of love is like a familial love, a family love. It's a love that you have no choice, right? I didn't choose my mom, didn't choose my dad, didn't choose my siblings, didn't choose my auntie or uncle, and I didn't choose my grandma. So the point is you have no choice over this, but you have this kind of familial family love because you share genetics, for God's sake. You know, it's a genetic family. You together you share some experiences. You may not like your auntie because she gossips all the time, but you know what? You'd go to the funeral, right? And the point is, it's just to show that there's a collective love. It's part of our self-identity, and it's part of that kind of, you know, the British understanding of blood is thicker than water, mate, yeah? The other type of love is friendship. And that's a very important type of love because this love is a choice. And not only is it a choice, but essentially what we do, we share experiences with our friends, we share same values, we share, for example, I don't know, worldviews, ideas, and those things are very important, and we almost fall in love with our friends. Another type of love, brothers and sisters and friends, is what we call eros, or erota, or agape. Agape in Greek is like an intense form of love. You could say it's passionate love, and that passionate love is between a husband and wife or between partners. And you have this passionate love because not only is it a choice, but it's a commitment. And it's a commitment, and I think it's best described in the words of Aristotle when he basically said that true love is like you take two souls, you put them in a bottle, you shake the bottle, and you can't distinguish which soul is which, or whose soul it belongs to. It's like it just intermingles and amalgamates together from that perspective, you know. And that love not only requires a commitment, like, you know, I've been married for God knows how long now, right? I think you get more for murder. I think you get less for murder, yeah? So the thing is, but I've realized, you know what? If I gave up at year 5, or year 4, or year 3, I would probably not understand the bliss of marriage now. But it took a long time. It takes a long time because it takes years to really get to know people. You know, my dad always says, a Greek saying, you have to have a bag of salt just to know somebody. And how much salt do you put in your food? Do you see? It takes years. So that kind of passionate love. Another type of love is motherly love, and it's very distinct and unique. And the reason being because motherly love is what you call unconditional and selfless love. Unconditional and selfless love. Your mom will love you and she doesn't care if you spit on her face, if you don't listen, if you hate her, she's always going to love you. It's standard. That's mothers for you. And mothers have this special type of love. I mean, at the end of the day, can we repay a billion kisses, a zillion worries, and a trillion hugs? You could never repay that. I mean, I haven't gone through labor, of course, but I've gone through the experience of my wife going through labor, and I'm telling you, hats off to women. Actually, we got a clap for women. And you'll realize this when you have children, brothers and sisters and friends, because I experienced a nearly 40-hour labor, and it crossed like nearly 2 days, and it crossed 2 days obviously, and basically it was 3-minute intense contractions from the beginning. And let me tell you something, my dad would always say this to me when I was growing up. He said, you know, Andrea, if men were to become pregnant, they will commit suicide, or they'll kill themselves, or they'll die, because they don't have the psychological structures in place. Like, I was thinking, if I had a baby that wanted to come out, I wouldn't wait 40 hours. The first 2 hours of pain, I was like, give me the knife, I'm carving this guy out, right? Yeah, because, you know, blokes, generally speaking, we get frustrated. So the point is, you know, mothers, and you know what's beautiful about labor? You go through pain, contractions, backache, thinking you're going to die, the mother's eyes are rolling, it's severe stuff. It's very severe stuff. But after the 40-hour labor and you have the child there, they cry and they're so happy, blissfully happy. And ask them about the pain. And I'm telling you, they say, what pain? Just a little tired. They almost forget the pain. And I think labor is a metaphor for life. Life's going to be full of ups and downs, but if you're patient, you're going to have the rewards at the end. So motherly love is very powerful. But there is another type of love that we seldom discuss. And Eric Fromm, who was a psychologist, he wrote the book The Art of Loving, he made a beautiful point. He said there's another type of love, and that love is called self-love. I love me. Now he said there's not an arrogant or narcissistic type of love. It's not a type of love that's egocentric, but it's the type of love that's based on self-respect. You don't want pain for yourself. You want pleasure. You want to feel happy. We all want to feel happy. In actual fact, there is no reason for happiness but happiness. Because if I ask you the question, why do you want to be happy? You'd be like, because I want to be happy. It's an end. It's a destination. It's a journey. It's a destination, not a journey. So we all want to be happy. And this is a form of self-love. This is what I want to talk about now. If we do love ourselves, and we all love ourselves from that perspective, then you must love God. Where's the link? Well, think about this, brothers and sisters. Who created you? Who created the physical causes in the universe in order for you to progress towards pleasure and run away from pain? Who is the source of love? Whose name is the loving? As in the Islamic tradition, Allah's name is Al-Wudud, which comes from the Arabic word wud, which means a giving type of love. Not just an internal love, but a giving type of love. And by the way, God gives it to you all the time, you don't even know it. There is something in your life that you haven't earned. There is something in your life that you don't deserve, but you get it all the time. You get it all the time, people. And you know what it is? It's this very moment and the very next moment and every moment of your existence. You don't own that moment. You can't even create a fly. You don't deserve another moment. Are you the source of your own existence? So you're given something so precious every single moment of your existence that you don't earn and you don't own. How should that make you feel? Don't be like the one who receives £100 every day, and after a year, he starts to think and fall in love with the £100 and not the one who gave it to him. So this love is a giving type of love. So it necessitates, if you love yourself, you must love God, because He facilitates that. And let me tell you something about the love of God. It's greater than the love of your mother. Why? Because I've been trying to think about this, and recently I think I found the answer humbly. A mother may have a selfless love. It might be an unconditional love, but it's still based on her need. If she didn't love you, she will feel pain. If she never loved you, she won't feel whole. If she never loved you, she won't have a sense of self. She needs to love you. But when God loves you, it's pure. Why? God is independent. He's free. The Islamic tradition will say He's al-Ghani. He's free of any need. He's independent. Everything depends on Him. So when someone doesn't need anything, when someone is perfect and free and independent in the most absolute and objective way and loves you, then that's the love. That is profound. So the question is, how do you start to enjoy this highest moral virtue, which is love? In the Islamic spiritual tradition, the Quran tells us, if you love God, then follow Muhammad, upon whom be peace, and God will love you. We believe in the Islamic tradition, brothers and sisters, that Muhammad, upon whom be peace, is a window to divine love. That's why Muslims go crazy, right? Not to justify killings and burning and all that rubbish, right? But Muslims do get emotional about Muhammad, upon whom be peace, because he is a window to divine love, not only a window to his love, but a window for divine bliss, eternity, paradise. And that's the paradigm you have to understand as empathic human beings, to empathize with other human beings, to understand they love him because this man is a window to the purest form of love, and he's a window to divine bliss for eternity. Now imagine that. Now whether you believe that's true or not is irrelevant. The point is, we believe it's true. So it creates a certain psychological disposition. So a window to God's love is following and loving Muhammad, upon whom be peace. And what a man to follow. I mean, if anyone studies his life, forget the Fox News narrative for one moment, please. The Bill O'Reilly show. Let's leave those aside for a moment. What about read about his life? Understand this man. Then not only would you believe he's a mercy to mankind and a window to the divine, but he was speaking the truth. Let me spend the last 10 minutes on this issue. The Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, he made a claim, brothers and sisters. His claim was that he was the final messenger of God. He said life is about La ilaha illallah. There is no deity worthy of worship but the deity, but God. That was it. So how can we assess his claim based upon his life? It's very simple. When we look at the authentic historical traditions, we can never conclude that he was lying. How can we conclude such a thing? How can he be a liar? He couldn't be a liar. Because he was offered riches, power, wealth. He was offered women, gold and glitter. He refused it. He said, no, I just want you to appreciate that your life is not about worshipping you. Your life is not about worshipping culture. Your life is not about worshipping society. Your life is not about worshipping the material world. Your life is not about worshipping L'Oreal because I'm worth it, right? Your life is about worshipping God because it's part of your nature and it frees you from the shackles of the enslavement to social pressure, your ego, your desires. Be truly liberated. That's what he wanted from society. But he was tortured, abused, someone stepped on his neck to the point that he broke, where his companion had to run and say, you're going to kill a man because he's a Rabb, his Lord, his God. You're going to kill a man for this? His companions were tortured and abused. He went to a town in Arabia, Taif, and he was stoned for hours. And blood was running down his legs, all because he wanted to preach to them, La ilaha illallah. There is nothing worthy of worship but God, but Allah. His beloved wife Khadijah passed away. May Allah have mercy on her. May Allah be pleased with her. He was so hungry, he tied 2 stones to his stomach. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, he was living on just aswadain, dates and water for like 2 months. There was no smoke coming from his household. He wasn't cooking anything. This man was abused, degraded. He was boycotted from his beloved city. He was so brave in one of the battles when he had to defend Muslims and non-Muslims because we had a concept of citizenship. It wasn't just the Muslims, it wasn't us and them. It was a social system protecting Muslims and non-Muslims. And when he had to fight in the Battle of Hunayn, because the polytheists of the time wanted to annihilate everybody, including the non-Muslims, there were so many arrows flying forward, all of his companions had to almost inevitably retreat, but he was still marching forward and he said, I am not a liar, I am the messenger of God. Such bravery. I mean, come on, let's just be honest. Anyone studying psychology, then is this the psychological profile of a liar? No. Maybe he was lying, or maybe, forget that, because it's impossible he was lying. Maybe he was deluded. Maybe he was speaking the truth, but he was just deluded. Well, I think when we go further into the narratives of his tradition and his life and his history, we can't make such a claim either. Here's a few examples. One example is there are many instances in his life, brothers and sisters, many instances, that he could have used to support his delusion. For example, his son Ibrahim passed away when he was young. And at that time, it happened to be a solar eclipse. The Arabs thought, oh my God, you must be the final messenger of God because look, he made the sun and moon eclipse each other because of your son. He said, no. The sun and moon are the signs of God. They're not eclipse for anybody's death. And there are many instances in his life that he could have used if he was deluded to support his delusion. We see this all the time. Right? Oh, he must love me because he looked that way. Yeah? We get all deluded and we get all these fantasies about these things. So he couldn't be deluded. Also, he couldn't be deluded, brothers and sisters, because of his prophecies. Phenomenal prophecies. You know, the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, he said, the day of judgment will come until you fight an army that has flat faces, they have faces like shields, fairy boots, slanted eyes. This is the Mongol invasion, which was an eco-catastrophe, especially in Baghdad. Also, he said that the hour won't come, the day of judgment, until you have barefooted Arabs compete with each other in tall buildings. Now, tall buildings wasn't a known concept in the 7th century Arabia. In actual fact, it hasn't been a known concept for maybe 1,000+ years or many years. And what's very interesting is, just up to the past 50 years, tall buildings would never make you think Arabia or the Middle East. Only recently, when the barefooted Arab, go to the history of UAE, go to the history of Saudi Arabia, before they found the black gold, which is oil, they were still mending goats and camels, and they were barefooted, literally. All of a sudden, they find this wealth. What does UAE do recently? Dubai, they have the Burj Khalifa, which is nearly 800 feet, right? It's massive. The tallest building in the world. And then who announced, out of competitive rage, that they're going to make a taller building 1,000 foot or 1 kilometer high? The Saudis, the barefooted Arabs, competing in high buildings. He also predicted that the first to join him from his family would be his daughter Fatima, radiallahu anha, may Allah be pleased with her. And she passed away 6 months after the death of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He predicted the death of Ammar, the martyrdom, because there was like a civil strife almost. And he said, "Oh Ammar, a rebellious group will kill you." And there are many more prophecies. And this is very interesting. This is a product of a deluded man. But for me, look at his teachings. His teachings are not the product of a deluded man. Look what he said. He said true richness is not having wealth. True richness is richness of the soul. The Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace said, "لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه." You won't truly believe unless you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And this brotherhood doesn't mean Muslim. It means humanity. Go to the classical tradition. Imam Rajab al-Hanbali, he wrote the book, The Compendium. He compares with other teachings of the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace. And he says this is people, human beings. Look at the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace when he says, God is compassionate and he loves compassion. He told his wife when his wife just slapped softly the face of a camel. He said, "Oh Aisha, be compassionate." Because when there's compassion in something, it elevates it. When you remove compassion, it degrades it. These are the kind of the meanings of the prophetic traditions. Also, the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace, he had the correct geopolitical philosophy. Food, shelter, and clothing for everybody. He said in the prophetic tradition, and I'm summarizing, that the son of Adam, the human being, his essential limited needs are food, shelter, and clothing, which creates an economic philosophy of distribution, not excessive competition. And this is in line with current geopolitical realities. The Food Agriculture Organization has said there's enough calories on this planet to feed everybody, 2,700 calories. If you include women, men, and children, this could feed almost 2 planets. And they conclude, if there's just distribution, which is the basis of Islamic economics. Look at his teachings. How can we say this man was a liar or was deluded? So therefore, he must have been speaking the truth. If he was speaking the truth, then his message is true. If his message is true, then he is truly a window to that divine love. And once we follow him and love him, Allah will love us. Now don't get me wrong. God loves human beings from the point of view that he is merciful. God says in the Quran, "My mercy encompasses everything." And as they say, mercy is another synonym for love. But there's a special type of love, muwaddah. And God will give that love if we love Muhammad, upon whom be peace, follow him, and embrace this amazing tradition. Now this doesn't mean God doesn't want to love everybody. But think about it. If God forced his special love on you, it would lose its meaning. Imagine I put a gun to his head and said, "Smile, give charity." It won't have any meaning. His smiling won't have meaning. His charity won't have meaning because I'm forcing him. God doesn't want to force his love on you. But it's almost like behind the door. So don't lock the door, put the shutters up, put security guards and mad dogs in front. God is saying, move those. All you have to do is open the door. And you receive divine love. And tasting it is the highest form of virtue. Who do you love? I love Muhammad, upon whom be peace. I love you guys. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, Jazakallah, Hamza. Inshallah, we're going to have a question and answer session now. Yusuf, could you grab one of the mics?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we'll have the first one here.
So if we come back to morality and God, you said that it's not possible for morality to come from evolution by itself. But I cannot really agree with that, because if you consider evolution, if you take a group of people, because we are not like bees, you use this example, but bees are actually behaving all together and they cannot really exist without each other and without the hive. So, but human beings can be put in nature, for example, and survive by themselves. But if we have a common moral together, if we have common rules, we can actually grow as a society, grow together. For example, don't kill if you don't kill someone because you don't like him. If you stop raping people, it's trying to do these bad things. You can actually grow stronger together, and you can actually defeat other either groups or other species, and you can actually do more than what you can do if you're acting alone. So I can't really agree with that. Now, if it does not really mean that God has no role in that, because if you actually believe in God, of course you believe that evolution is part of the process that He actually designed for man. That man was supposed to evolve in this way, and He planned that. But I really think that evolution is the key there. That it's just that God. Well, I'm agnostic, so I don't really believe if there is God or not. But actually, I believe that if there is a God, in this sense, He has planned evolution and just moral as being a result of that. And that's why He has to send, for example, the prophets to make sure that people, as they grow stronger in their brain, because now we believe we know more things than our ancestors, so we can actually reflect in a different way. So if we don't have, like, sometimes someone to remind us, for example, you should not do that because now you can think even more differently.
Just give me time to remember all of that, yeah?
Sorry.
I'm trying to be as patient as possible. Okay, let me just address a few things and you can continue, right? So the first thing is, I agree you can have morality from evolution. I never disagreed with that. My point was, it doesn't explain objectivity of these morals. That's the point. So there's a big difference in the argument. And also you have to understand, yes, human beings can live individually, and therefore morals come from evolution. But you have to also understand that rats can live individually as well. And we don't have the morality of rats, do we? So the point is, I don't think your argument follows. But yes, you're right. Moral, in terms of capacity for morals, can come from evolution. Doesn't explain the argument, though. That's a different discussion. What we're saying is, if there are some morals that are objective, evolution cannot be a grounding for that. So that's the difference in the argument from that perspective. The other thing is, you said about our minds and us being progressive, and the more we learn. You know, I was going to give this lecture in a different way today. I was going to say, if morals are based upon reason, then morals are based upon God. Because you can't have reason without God. It is true. Because how can we justify that we have rational faculties? How can we trust our own minds? Because rationality can't come from non-rationality. Because if we believe in a naturalistic, materialistic universe, then how on earth can rationality come from cold, random, irrational, physical processes? And you can't say, well, we'll know when we get the science right. No, I'm sorry. Because you need this as an assumption before you even have science. So you can't say science will agree with it, because they'll be arguing in a circle. So the point is, how can you even trust your own minds? And evolution can't be the answer to this. Why? Because evolution is not about truth value. It's not about rationality. It's about survivability. It's about survival value. And you can have irrational beliefs that lead to survival. So therefore, how do we trust our minds? Even Darwin, he wrote a letter to his friend Mr. Graham in 1881 saying, if we evolved like primates, then we have a problem. Are there convictions in the primates, in the mind of a primate? How can we trust our minds if it just came from random, cold, biological, irrational processes? Because if you have irrationality plus more non-rationality and more non-rationality, all you're going to get is non-rationality. Like 0 plus 0 plus 0 is always going to be 0. So the best thing that explains that we trust our minds is the fact that there was a deity who is cognitive, if you like, who has knowing, he's got the totality of wisdom and knowledge, and create human beings that could trust their mind in order to reach him and understand him. So therefore, if reason leads to morals, then therefore God leads to morals, because you need God to have reason. Do you see the link there? I was going to give that argument instead, but I thought it would be boring. Yes, ma'am. I could hear from then. I'll repeat your question.
I just have a couple of questions. The first one was, you mentioned God being self-sufficient, not dependent on anything. I think that's compatible with the traditional philosophical view of God and also Judeo-Christianity.
Yeah, of course.
But I was wondering, if he had all these attributes before he ever created anything, then what was he doing before he created anything? How could he be loving without anything to show his love to? Doesn't that make him dependent? And then my second question was... Let
me stick to the first one, because I won't remember the second one, and I'll get back to you. So the first question was, your view on God is in line with the Judeo-Christian understanding. However, but before the universe. What was the question? Say that again.
How could he be loving before he created anything to
How
love?
could he be loving before he created anything to be loving to? That's the question. Well, I think the fundamental assumption behind that question is that love, being loving, for example, requires something to love. I don't think that's true. Because you could love yourself, right?
So I take that that sounds to me like he was self-absorbed and not self-given.
No, he could be both. Because he created the universe, maybe because he wanted to be loved. And by the way...
So he was self-given when he had nothing to give himself to.
Self-giving, but he's giving to himself, isn't it? That's the point. So he's independently loving himself. That's not a general problem. And you know what the thing is, what's interesting about these questions is, even if you can't answer the question, it doesn't negate he exists and who he is. Like for example, some people say, for example, if God's eternal and he created the universe, what was he doing for eternity on his own? And I answer, exactly what he was doing on his own. Right? And that's why I say, you didn't know me for 34 years of my life. Just because you don't know what I was doing for 34 years of my life, it doesn't mean I don't exist now, right? So I think those questions sometimes they're interesting, but they don't necessarily theologically or even philosophically negate the existence of or the character of a deity, right? But they are interesting questions. To be honest, my answers are probably just rubbish. But yeah, but the other thing that we can affirm, and this is what we call the role of the mind, is that you only affirm what God says about himself, because you can't go too much into it, because that would be basically you making your mind up on who this God is, who basically you can't even analogize, you can't even compare to yourself, you can't even do anything. He's totally distinct and disjoined from the universe. Laysa kamithlihi shay, we say in the Islamic tradition. He's unique and absolute, and we're not, and we can't really even fathom. For us to even understand something has to come via him, via his own revelation. So God really hasn't answered the question what he was doing. Could he still be the loving? Now there are some opinions. One opinion is from Ibn Taymiyyah, 14th century theologian. He basically said, well, there's always been creation. So there's always been something to love. But he says creation doesn't mean it's eternal, but God's been creating for eternity, but each act of creation is finite. So you can't say that creation is eternal just like God, because that would be blasphemous, right? So that was one argument from Ibn Taymiyyah. You had another argument from Al-Ghazali, who said, no, God, basically, he has his own independent will, and he was with himself for eternity, and then he created the universe. Now, you know, the other theological nuances, I don't think there really is a solid answer, to be honest, but the question itself doesn't really negate, I think, the fact that there may be a deity and the fact that he is who he is. Now, I do hear this argument from Christians sometimes when they say that the Trinity is necessary for God to love, but I don't think that really makes sense, because a classical Christian understanding, they have a concept of homoousios. Homoousios in the Greek language means he has one essence. So really, when they say he has three distinct personalities, there is still one essence. So it doesn't really argue anything. It's just, you know, it's still loving yourself, really. So if you love Jesus, it's still him, because they're still part of the same essence. So, you know, anyway, all these different discussions. But I don't know what the basis of your question was. Was there anything more fundamental to say after that? I don't know. Question number 2. No, she had another question, so we did say.
Oh yeah, I did. Sorry.
Sorry, I lost you with all those words, right?
So you mentioned many different kinds of love, like friendship, and the love of the love of the mother, and I'm thinking the being who's grounded in absolute love, surely he encompasses all of those. And if he does, then the best love he could give would be to give himself. So yeah, you're right. There was something behind my first question, mainly that I'm a member of the Christian Union. And that is what Christians believe, that he loves so much that he gives the best gift he possibly could, a priceless gift, an invaluable one, himself.
Yeah, I don't buy that, because he didn't give himself, frankly, without being rude.
That sounds quite distant though.
No, but he tortured himself, didn't he? Because if Jesus was God, right, and he was tortured on the cross, see, that giving is not like, because it actually negates another form of love, which is self-love. So for me,
exactly, it's a selfless love. It's self-given. It's self.
I don't know, because if you don't love yourself, how can you love anybody else? Like if you don't, like, you know, for me, it's for me. I don't see it that it's in line with the perfection of God. One, for him even to have a son, because because I know in the Christian tradition, you don't believe that Jesus, the human, was fully God. He had a center of consciousness. He was part human, part God in terms of his nature. He had a human nature, and that's why there's the easy reconciliation between.
That's slightly different.
Yeah, no, but the reason I'm trying to address this is because the concepts have to make sense, generally speaking, and I think it doesn't make sense because we would argue from an Islamic, what we say is pure monotheism, that God can't really, become flesh per se. And that for us is a problem, because for example, God created the table. If I create this table, I don't become the table. And by greater reason, not an analogy, but by greater reason, God therefore is distinct and disjoint from the universe. So via his power and will, he can still show his love without necessarily, giving a son and that son to be sacrificed in such a way. And not just that, we would even consider it unjust as well, because someone who's not at fault is basically suffering for someone else's wrongs, and that intrinsically for us is problematic and immoral from that perspective. Yeah? But it doesn't follow that you have to give yourself in order to be absolutely loving, because God could give us life, and life comes from himself. We don't know how, because we believe that God breathed into Adam. The ruh, the soul, it was God's spirit. But we don't know what that means in a metaphysical, spiritual sense. But that is a form of giving. God has given you life. You don't deserve it, you don't own it. And what's more interesting is that God gave us the kind of rational and spiritual faculties to understand that we have individual responsibility, that no one's going to take the burden of my sin and my wrongs. And that's why I would argue that our concept is a little bit more what I would call maybe spiritually liberating, because the birth of a child is not a negative thing. He's not carrying anybody's sin. He's not carrying Adam's sin. He's not carrying no one's sin. He is pure. And that's why we have the concept of fitra, which means the innate, beautiful state. And from that, it creates the concept of innocence and intrinsic goodness. We don't believe in it. It's kind of like you're intrinsically evil, and that's it. Now you have to repay for stuff. You can never repay it, because the only thing that could be shed is God's blood, essentially, because Jesus was God. And that's a big problem for us from a theological, just, and even ethical perspective. Your children, you can answer back. But children, for example, my son, for example, we do this as parents. He runs into the door, he bangs his head. You naughty door! You don't go to the couch and say, naughty door, right? And, conceptually, this for us, it's just that, because don't forget, all of God's names and attributes are intertwined together by his oneness. We don't see them in isolation. So, being just is like a form of love, isn't it? Because if he hit you, if I was just loving to the one who did the evil, then I'm unloving to you. Do you see? So the point is, I don't think it works from that perspective. Humbly, of course. You could talk. We could give it one back if you want.
Okay. Oh, sorry, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we're feeling a lot here.
You're feeling the love, yeah?
Mr. Tzortzis, thank you for your speech. I really appreciate that you put some of your own experience into the speech as well, candid yourself.
Like my father, yeah?
Yeah, it's good to have some personhood behind the speech, so I'm grateful for that.
Thank you.
I think you brought the speech onto the concept of love, which I think is probably even more interesting than the topic implied by the title. And my question is about that. You mentioned about how God, in your opinion, is even more loving than a mother. And a mother gives a lot of herself. And that's a very noble thing. Like you described your wife, she was in labour for, I think you said 40 hours. And we know ourselves that mothers give so much. I want to know, why do you think God's love is greater than the love of a mother? What's the cost to God? You mentioned that God is self-sufficient. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need the creation. I understand that. But what is it that it costs him to love us? You mentioned about every moment that we have is from him. And the next moment. And that's great, I see that. But what does it cost him? If he's already self-sufficient, what does it cost him above another?
Yeah, but the question implies that there is no God. Because if God if it costs him anything, then by definition he's not God anymore. That's the point. I wouldn't want to worship that God, because that God is limited, anthropomorphic, and weak. Frankly, that's not a God that deserves worship. And he sounds quite contingent on a relationship with somebody else. If he's contingent, dependent on a relationship with somebody else, things that are contingent are actually created. I don't believe in a creative God. So this is why we fundamentally disagree with the Christian narrative or the later day Christian narrative, because we would humbly believe, if you study early Christian history, the early church fathers generally were not Trinitarians, at best binitarians. So what I would say is that if it costs God anything, then how can he be God? Because he's dependent on something. And things that are contingent and dependent by their own very nature are created. If they're created, it's not God by definition. So that for me would be a big problem. Now the reason I said God's love is greater than mother's love is because her love is still slightly selfish. Because it fulfills her, it makes her whole, and it completes her, and she needs to love her child. God doesn't need anything, and yet when he does love, for me that's like, wow, that's like totally pure. By the way, I could be totally wrong on so many different things, and I thoroughly admit that, and so does my wife on a regular basis. Yes, sir?
So you say that God has the ultimate...
You know, I have a power of telepathy. Can I prove it?
You can't, no.
Can I prove it now? I could almost guarantee, that you're Greek.
But you know that already.
Why do I know that?
People know it around here.
I never knew that you were Greek.
My accent.
Your accent, yeah. The Greeks have a very kind of, it's like quasi-Spanish accent, a little bit more warm, a little bit more romantic, I think. You know, it's bordering sexy, I have to say. You have a sexy accent.
We'll talk later.
What's your name?
Dimitris.
Dimitris, that's my cousin's name.
Alright, great. So,
Nasagala Dimitris.
you too.
How about we say?
Not Greek now.
Yeah, but where are you from anyway, just to know?
Athens.
Athens.
Yeah. So, you say that God doesn't need our love, and he has the pure form of love. Why did he create us? Why did he create us to love him if he doesn't need our love?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Wouldn't that imply that, I don't know, if before the creation he was receiving no love, he wanted the love, so he created us.
No,
does
he's
that make him a
independent.
narcissist?
Yeah, it doesn't imply that he needs something. What did you say at the end? I didn't catch it.
Does that make him a narcissist?
A narcissist?
Yes, I get this kind of view. I asked
that
the
he
same
loves
question
himself,
2 days ago.
That he loves himself, basically.
That he makes us, which are his creation, to love him. So,
Okay.
yes.
See, narcissism is only bad if it's arrogated to somebody who doesn't deserve it. But to be honest, bro, God, by the very definition of God, deserves all worship and love. You're anthropomorphizing. If God was a human being, then yeah, why should I love you, man? Why are you such a narcissist? But God is God. He's the one who freely gives you every moment of your existence. I mean, if you're not going to even thank that person, then we have the problem, right? And thankfulness is a form of worship, and worship is also a form of love. So I don't think it follows. The other thing which is very interesting is, why did God create us to love him in the first place? I think answering that question actually denies God. I'll tell you why. Because there are some questions that you can never answer, because you would assume that you have the totality of wisdom. We don't. God has the picture, we just have the pixel. And by the way, if we can't even answer that question, it doesn't negate anything I said. But I think the narcissism piece is, it doesn't follow.
Hi.
What great questions, by the way. It shows how clever people are. You're doing a great job.
Russell Group.
Southampton's doing a good job. You know, I was even at King's and I was at Queen Mary and all these big unis, right? But you guys, I have to admit, I'm not just saying this to please you, top notch. Top notch.
With the question, does morality need God? I would just like to pose, does God need morality? In the sense of, like, within Islam, there is, how do I put this mildly, homophobic attitude, in the sense of, like, within the Quran it says that homosexuals should be stoned. So, if God is loving, and he created the entire universe, why would he care about where
call it pee-pee, bro. It doesn't sound that nice. Makes it sound quite small as well.
But yeah, but on a serious level, I mean, how does the...
Yeah, let me answer that question.
Yeah, how does stoning gay people come into the whole...
Yeah, well, firstly, very easy, the Quran never mentions that you stone gay people. If you can find it for me, I'll probably give you £1,000. It doesn't mention you stone gay people. It doesn't, okay? That's a Fox News narrative. The second point is that yes, we got to be honest, in the Islamic spiritual tradition, just like the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, and some forms of Buddhism, homosexuality in terms of its action is seen as sinful. Not because they're homosexual, it's because it's a sexual act outside of marriage. Anything. That includes swinger parties, that includes prostitution, includes everything. So we don't say, see the thing is, we have to, it was a very European-centric concept that we said, that they said, we as Europeans said, homosexuality is wrong. Islam never actually said that. All it said was, sodomy outside of marriage and in marriage is wrong. It didn't say you having homosexual feelings, you're to be discarded as a filthy human being. So we're not homophobic. I contend with that. Let me finish. Let me finish. You come back to me. I will give you time all day. I'll be here until 2 in the morning. Don't worry. If the Chancellor allows us, the Vice Chancellor allows us. Right? So basically, what we have to say is we're not homophobic. We don't have an irrational hatred. In our classical tradition, for example, in our books on prayer, someone could lead the prayer and he could have been what you call someone who practiced, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but the homosexual act, sodomy. So we don't have like, oh my God, he's gay. No, I have gays in my family. Okay, don't want to throw them off no building. All right. But the point is this though: is it a sin? 100% from the Islamic spiritual tradition. Doesn't mean you should be unjust and you should be discriminatory towards people. No way. I mean, even my experience when I was a project manager, my boss was gay, and I've got to be honest, he had more morals than some Muslims. Yeah, decent human being. So what we're going to say is this. If you as a Muslim, by the way, you could be Muslim and have homosexual feelings. This is well known. You can have the feeling, the disposition of being a homosexual, and you're still Muslim. You're even still a Muslim even if you practice the act. You'd be very sinful, it would be a major sin. The only thing that makes you not a Muslim is when you say, God thinks it's okay. That's what makes you not a Muslim. So, there's no homophobia. There's no injustice and discrimination. We actually believe that, the homosexual, the LGBT community have spiritual needs as well. So we want to talk about these fundamental issues. Now, your argument now, God is not loving because he thinks that homosexuality is a sin. Well, that's not a problem with the ruling or the command. It's actually a problem with you haven't understood where it's come from. Let me give you what I call the moral algebra of God. If God said X, what is the truth value of X? If God by definition said X, X is the unknown in algebra, right? If God said X, what is the truth value of X? It's true. So the only thing you need to discuss really is, did he say X and does he exist? If you could argue those and come to a rational foundation, then these things wouldn't be a problem. But I do agree that in the Muslim community, we think homosexuality is more of a taboo than being bad to your mother. Saying off to your mother is a major sin. Do you see? But we don't say, oh my God, he was bad to his mother. But we get so crazy because someone, has a disposition. I mean, lots of people have dispositions, or we'll call it a nature disposition, whatever you want. The point is, in the Islamic spiritual tradition, it's a sin, its practice is a sin, but we don't condemn the person for having the disposition. And in the Islamic spiritual context, we say, God has given this to you as a test, and you have spiritual tools at your disposal to overcome this test, and that's our narrative. We're not going to compromise and say it's all fine. No, that's not our tradition. But in terms of, the Quran says this, that, and the other, no. But at the end of the day, you also have to understand that from a legal perspective, in a social context, the public manifestation of sexual acts outside of marriage are punishable. That's the legal framework of Islam. However, just like the prophetic practice, he didn't want those punishments to be enacted. They were seen as a deterrent. That's our concept of penal code. It's for a deterrent, not to be enacted. And that's why he told people to go away. He didn't want to hear their stories or their self-confessions, for example. And the conditions are so high that I'm telling you it's impossible to get caught. For example, fornication, right? If you're a fornicator, in order for you to be judged by due process and a law, you need 4 pious witnesses. Meaning, they're pious. They've never lied before publicly, which is almost impossible in these day and age. Not only must there be 4 pious witnesses, they have to agree with everything, to the point they have to see the pen going into the ink, right? And they had to see it not in somebody's house, because if you look into somebody's house, it's considered spying and you're not pious witness anymore. It had to be done in public. Now the funny thing is, I'm from London. There's a place in Soho called London. Everyone knows it's funny, it's known for funny business. Even in Soho you don't see those public acts, right? So the point is, when people say, the Sharia is so crazy, I like to relate the words of Professor Noah Feldham from Harvard University. He says, look, we always talk about these so-called penal codes, but we never talk about the kind of values and the really harsh conditions that you need to even enact them, which is almost impossible. So we need to have a more nuanced dialogue. Yes, we're not going to compromise on our tradition, but we need to be more nuanced. We need to be more nuanced and understand it. You may still disagree, but I think the way to understand that disagreement is just think about the algebra I said in the beginning. Hope that helps.
Excuse me? Sorry. I have a question. You have said that God transcends all human subjectivity in His morals. And there are already human organizations, which like human rights, for example, which have a right for the same objective morals that all people can reach or can conclude. But the problem of these organizations, not that they have reached the objective morals. The problem is that they cannot execute their laws, their evaluations. They say this is moral, but they cannot execute what they are saying, and still massacres, and they cannot stop it. So the problem is not justice or evaluation of morality, but postponed justice. And if justice is the most or the superior kind of love, and if there is no justice nowadays, so the problem is procrastinated or postponed love or justice. And how can we solve this problem if we are just still able to wait to another kind of justice, another goal? So before I must love or believe in God's love or justice, I must believe first in another world, in another same world, and this is a problem. How can we solve this problem?
What I gather from your question is that we live in an unjust world. So how can we love God if the world is unjust, right? Is that what you're saying?
Sure, I love God and I believe in another world, but if we have now among us, the very question, is there another world? Now there is no justice, there is incomplete justice.
Yes.
Because there are oppressed and there is no justification of what is happening. And this is a kind of postponed justice. How can I classify or justify this for non-believers who don't believe in another world? How God's love exists while... So they should believe first in another world before they believe in God's love and God's justice.
Yes, that's true. So tell them and show them there's another world. That's it.
If they are materialistic and they don't change.
Well, discuss with them. Plant seeds in the heart and mind. We're not fascists. We don't tell people what to believe. Just plant the seeds. Maybe show them what we said in the end, towards the end, that we've got good reason to believe in this man and his claim. If his claim is true, then there is a hereafter. But then you could articulate so many good reasons why God exists and why there's a hereafter. We have the remarkable features of the Quran. We have a range of arguments for God's existence. This is not a problem. So you're right. You've pinpointed the fundamental question.
You don't want to wait. They want to see now, because if I wait, they claim that death is the end of this life. And how can, if I can reach this truth outside this life, the truth will
that can all be that can all be changed if you show them the fundamental basis of Islam. God exists, He's one, He deserves to be worshipped, and the Quran is His message, and the Prophet is His messenger. If you could articulate this, then whatever comes from that is true. Because the principle is, whatever comes from truth is truth. Okay?
Okay, and that's what we have time for on the question and answer session, inshallah. I'd like to ask the President of the ISOC to present the gift for the speaker. Why is it here? last thing today, inshallah, if I could ask the speaker today, Hamza, if you'd like to, so I believe we have 236 people here today, and inshallah we have a prize for someone to win, inshallah.
So what do you want to do?
Please
Enter, yeah? Bismillah.
171. Who's the... We have 171.
It's like darts, isn't it? 180.
Okay, we'll go again, inshallah, because it was actually committing number.
Okay, let's do another one. Ready? Bismillah.
219.
Hey! Oh, let her open it, man. How rude of me. It's a gift card, sister. Well done.
Okay,